You're saying like people recognize and they don't live with rulers, so even if people proclaim to say I am your ruler now, it's not going to make a difference because those people already recognize there's no need for rulers, there is no rulers. So you can't really change that. When people own themselves and they recognize that and they practice that, you can't really undo that unless you use perhaps, I guess, a lot of violence upon that individual, but that would require that individual to submit, to surrender. And I don't think people who want to be free, who are free, are going to want to give up their freedom so easily. What would you have to say about the people who say, well, if government is just a monopoly and it's just a gang per se, well, wouldn't there just be another gang or a group of warlords who just take over? Is another thing people say.
Well, my answer to that is yes, there will be if people still believe they need a ruler. If you shake off one ruler but you still think you need a ruler, then of course another one's going to pop up. So the way to prevent that happening is for people to reject the idea of being ruled anymore. I mean, it's like any other kind of barbaric practices from the past that we've kind of moved on from now. It's like, are they going to come back? Well, I mean, they might, like burning witches or something. Like, is that going to happen again? Probably not. But if people start believing in witches again, then yeah, it will. So there is a kind of a truth to that quote about eternal vigilance. You do kind of need to constantly make sure that nobody's going to rule over you. But the best possible starting place for that is to have anarchy, because there's nothing there at all for a potential tyrant to kind of get hold of. If you have a minarchist government, if you have courts, police, and military run by the government, I mean that's like an open invitation for a wannabe tyrant. All they've got to do is take over the state, and then they can start, spreading their power and doing whatever atrocities they plan to do. Yeah. So you've got to kind of get rid of the state entirely, and there's nothing for them to do. They can become they can become rich. They become head of a powerful security agency, but they don't have any special rights. They don't have any special privileges from that. They're just an ordinary person. And if people are vigilant and they're looking out for this, they're going to keep an eye on these people that have kind of a lot of economic power to make sure it doesn't become political power, and make sure they don't go from being a head of a security firm to a government. Because that's the key point there, is when it becomes a monopoly. So you want to stop it before that point. And I don't think that would be a very difficult thing to do once you've got a society where people are no longer willing to put up with being ruled. I think it's going to be difficult to prevent a new ruler from happening. So you're the worst people in society would then just be petty thieves and thugs who don't have the law on their side, so they're relatively harmless.
And everybody sees them as wrong. They don't see them as morally legitimate for doing what they're doing.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the key difference with the state, really, isn't it? It's a gang of thieves with very good propaganda, because they've somehow convinced their victims that the gang is necessary and that we steal for your own good, kind of thing. They are very good at propaganda. They've convinced people they're legitimate, and without that, they'd be nothing.
Yeah. Another concern that some people have is that if there were no government, then smaller private gangs would spring up to rob, oppress, and enslave people. There are a couple of reasons why this fear is misguided. First of all, even private street gangs and organized crime today exists mainly because of government, not in spite of it. Notice how many gangs today get their funding from trading in illegal black markets, drugs, gambling, prostitution, guns, etc., which were all created by government laws. In a free society, thugs and thieves, individually or in gangs, wouldn't have any black markets to take over. More importantly, people who fear that without government, warlords would take over are ignoring how much people's perceptions matter. A criminal gang which everyone recognizes as illegitimate and immoral has far less power than a gang whose aggression is perceived to be legitimate and legal, its commands and demands being called laws and taxes, and any who disobey being seen as criminals. In other words, a population is far more likely to be oppressed by a gang which the people themselves imagine to have the right to rule than by some gang that everyone knows is bad and that everyone would feel perfectly justified in disobeying and resisting even forcibly. Imagine a private gang trying to do what government now does, extorting and bossing everyone around. But imagine if they tried that without any aura of legal authority. Then imagine how a well-armed population would respond. The gang would fail quickly and dramatically, and all those who resisted them would be viewed as righteous heroes. But when the people feel morally obligated to obey the politicians' laws, anyone who resists are viewed as criminals or tax cheats, even by their own friends and neighbors. Most people see government domination as necessary and valid, and so they cooperate with their own victimization. That is why government gets away with far more oppression and extortion than private gangs ever could, because most of the victims of legal thuggery and theft see it as necessary and legitimate. Millions of people tolerate the confiscation of a huge portion of their earnings and tolerate having many of their choices and behaviors forcibly limited and controlled by way of legislation, as long as the people giving the orders are seen as a legitimate political authority. But in a situation where the people don't accept the idea that someone else has the moral right to rob them and rule them, the people stop cooperating and start resisting. This is why the presence of government drastically increases the chances of people getting robbed. In fact, increases the chances 100%, since every government taxes the people it pretends to represent. Meanwhile, the lack of an authoritarian ruling class makes the people far less susceptible to being extorted and dominated, and far more likely to disobey and resist any would-be thieves and thugs. To put it another way, warlords already did take over, called themselves government, and convinced their victims that it was righteous and necessary for the warlords to dominate and exploit everyone else for their own good.